Hi guys, this is SDJRSNF88 speaking with the fourth update on the WW1 Trench Railway project. And as you can see, there's been plenty of progress since the last update. So without further ado, let's get started. So to kickstart this update, I thought we'd take a look at one of the most major changes since the previous, and that is of course the start of the landscaping. And as you can see, the ridge has really started to take shape. This is all constructed from one sheet of polystyrene installation, the sort of stuff you use in your roof. And what I've done is I've just sort of glued it down, sort of cut it to size and shape, and sort of, changed the contours of it to sort of give the rough sort of effect of the hillside that this sort of layout is sort of set in. So to the left of the shot, you can see the road, which is gradually rising towards the back scene. Then in the centre, you've got the artillery gun, which is set into the hillside itself. And then to the far right of the shot, you can see the trench, which the railway itself actually enters. So without further ado, we'll take a closer look at each of those key points of this sort of hillside, and I'll explain my reasoning behind the sort of design of it. So here's a closer look at where the artillery gun is set into the ridge. And as you can see, the land has been cut away at an angle to the left and to the right, and then you got it pretty flat along the front there, but there's a lip where basically it sort of rises up, goes into the hillside, and then rises up again. This is quite a common feature of many trenches, so I really wanted to include this with this trench. Basically, this is sort of like a little step up in a way. So basically, there would have been a ladder up onto the first section, then a ladder up onto the other section. As in scale forms, this is much higher and much deeper than the majority of trenches, of course, because you're hiding vehicles in this one. But basically, this would have allowed soldiers to sort of have a little sort of step up, and then another step up to actual sort of viewing over the top there. And I may add a ladder in or something or other there, just to sort of give the effect of maybe a sort of someone that's operating the artillery gun, sort of like looking out over the top just to check if anything's sort of in the distance there. Of course, this is all going to be sort of lined, so trench walls. For this, I've been looking at many pictures from sort of books and on the internet of what types of trench wall there were, and there really were hundreds of different types of retaining wall for trenches. You had sandbags, corrugated iron sheets, timber. So there were loads of timber ones, including you actually had sort of a bit like wicker ones in a way, that in some cases. But there were also ones that were sort of made up of just like trunks and branches off of trees. And then, of course, you had sort of ones that are made from planks, and that is what I plan to depict here. So how I plan to depict this is using coffee stirrers. So as you can see, I've found some really fine coffee stirrers here, and these will be layered up to obviously matching heights of the wall, and they'll basically be glued together and painted up. And as you can see, it'll give the effect of sort of a planked sort of retaining trench wall. Now, of course, as this is quite a deep sort of cut in to the landscape, there will be rocks sort of bursting through. So somewhere to say to this area here, as you see, there's quite a substantial sort of raised area here. I've bought some Woodland Scenics realistic rocks, and what I'll do is I'll cut them into this sort of the hillside, and then basically the planks will be shaped around this stone, as I did see that there were some trenches that were cut into quite hard rock, and rather than cutting away at the hard rock, they simply just planked around the sort of areas of loose soil around these rocks. And that's something that I like to achieve here as well. I think it'll give the hillside a lot more texture. So this is where the railway enters the trench, and this would be done pretty much the same way as what you've just seen with the artillery gun, with the sort of the planked edges lining the trench walls there. But one thing I've been really thinking about is how to disguise the trench as it enters the back scene. And one idea I've come up with is a bridge. Now, I've been looking at sort of pictures of trenches, all different sorts of trenches, on the internet and in books. And in many of these sort of pictures, they have sort of bridges, these little footbridges that would have allowed sort of soldiers to sort of cross from one side to the other. In some cases, these were quite as simple as just a few planks, and in others, they were sort of a bit more elaborate and actually sort of set in. Some of them were even made of metal. So I sort of plan to recreate something to go in the place right up against the back scene there, where that sort of barbed wire strip is at the moment, so where that holder is, where the barbed wire goes. And that will sort of be blended in, sort of camouflage the railway as it enters into the back scene. And one of the most common ones I've seen is sort of using tree trunks, so sort of quite substantial sort of branches that were quite thick, and sort of bundling them together and then sort of line them across the top of the trench. And that's what I'm going to try and do here. I'm going to try and find some material that sort of gives the effect of a trunk of a tree, and I'm going to lie it across the top there and sort of provide sort of a couple of sort of centimetres away from the sort of the back scene there to give the effect that the trains are passing under this little bridge, and of course the trench sort of continues on the other side, but by that point it's sort of at a visible view on the back scene, so it'll sort of blend the railway in quite nicely there. So I've got to still figure out how to do that, but hopefully that'll work out and it'll sort of solve that problem. So one thing I forgot to touch on in the previous update, and I've had a few comments about, is of course the back scene. And as you can see, it's a rather lush green looking scene, and not really most people's representation of what the Great War was like. When you mention the war, most people seem to think of the grey skies, the muddy fields and the war-torn landscape. But in many cases there were scenes very much like this, and this is something which I wish to depict, and of course makes complete sense for the sort of the location of this layout. As I mentioned, this is an artillery battery, so there wouldn't have been any fighting really in the close vicinity of this sort of location. It's quite a safe point, so hence the reason why there's a lot of troops will be moved around here, and obviously the vehicles are going to be refuelled and rearmed, and basically the whole point of the artillery gun being here as well. So the front line itself will be a couple of miles in the distance beyond the tree line there. So this is sort of a safe zone. So hence the reason why this area is going to be a lot more greener than other parts of the battlefield. Of course, there will be plenty of mud as well as the green on here. Of course, you can see the two tanks there, the ones on the road, and the Mark 1, which you've seen obviously before. That is right sitting where the main sort of yard is going to be, and that's going to be a very, very muddy area where, of course, all the tanks and vehicles have been coming in, all the men have been walking, and obviously that's churned up the earth there, so that'd be a very, very muddy location. But really, most of the other parts of the layout are going to be quite green, which I think would be quite different for a World War I themed layout. So let me know what you think in the comments below, and whether you think it's a good idea, and we will take a look at some of the other greenery that's being applied to the layout. So here's the wooded area, and as you can see, the railway line sort of emerges from the wood there. Now the wood has been created using the sort of these woodland scenic tree rows. I've purchased a second one, which is just located to the left of the shot there now, and I think it blends in quite well, and it really disguises sort of the entrance to the fiddle yard. Of course, I'm going to plan to add a lot more trees in here to sort of blend it in a bit more. I'm going to put a few more trees in behind to sort of raise the sort of height of the wood, so it blends in with the wood that you can see on the back scene there. And I'm even going to go to the sort of depths of adding a few trees actually inside the fiddle yard. So if you just see where my hand's to in the fiddle yard there, I plan to add a few in there to sort of really give the effect that there's not actually a fiddle yard there, and it's just really sort of entering a wooded area. As well as this, I plan to add a few more trees to the right of the shot. So as you can see, the road is climbing up towards the back scene there, and one of the most hardest things to do, which has been described by many modellers and it's been mentioned many times in countless modelling magazines, is how to sort of disguise a road going into a back scene, and this is right in the centre of the layout practically, so it's very, very noticeable. And I was having this thought on how do I blend this road into this sort of rather lush green field. And the idea is basically to have a few more trees here, and they will create like a wooded arch, so the road will sort of go into an arch of trees and basically blend in that way. So the idea is the sort of where the wall is here, which is just behind the building, that's got to be raised up anyway. There'll be polystyrene put in there and obviously landscaped, and then there'll be a few more trees put in there. It'll be arched over, and then there'll be a few trees just to the right there on the edge of the ridge. And I think that'll blend the wall in quite nicely. I may even go out and find a similar sort of location of like a road in an arch of trees, and take a photo and print that off and stick that actually inside the arch of trees. So if you sort of kneel down when you're looking at the layout and look through the trees, you'll be able to see there actually is a road continuing on off into the distance. So I think that'll blend that in quite nicely. So this is the corner of the sort of the farmyard here. You can just see the wood to the top of the shot there. And what I plan to do here is sort of have a sort of area of static grass, and this will sort of be blended in quite nicely. This will all be sort of raised just a little bit and have sort of like a gradual slope towards the track there. just give the idea of sort of a bit of a rolling field, and I think it'd just be a nice sort of area to put in there. And of course, this will be a nice place to put a load of those poppies that you've seen in the previous update as well. So one thing I've been really working on since the previous update is the painting of the Resin Barn, and as you can see, it's complete, and I must admit, I'm over the moon with how this has turned out. I've used a dry brushing technique. This is something I've never ever used before, and basically dry brushing is where you get a bit of paint on the end of your brush, you wipe off the majority of the paint on a tissue or something, and then you basically just brush stroke what's left of the paint finally onto the building, and then you repeat the process with a number of different tones. So for this I've used a number of greys and a bit of red in there as well, sort of a red browny, sort of red brick sort of colour, which is the sort of the mortar for the stonework. And then I've used about 5 different tones of a light grey, dark grey, stonework, and basically I've built it up, and gradually you sort of build up this beautiful stonework effect, and I'm just really pleased with how this has turned out. You can see I've also painted the doors green. It's rather patchy sort of green, which gives the effect that the barn has fallen into disuse, which it has. And you can see it's rather fainted around the sort of the latches on the door, which is obviously where the soldiers and men would have been opening up the doors and maybe hiding equipment from prying eyes in there as well. Now, as well as this, that you can see there's a lot of sort of the parts of the building have sort of fallen into ruins. So you can see there's a few shell holes in the building there, and around the back of the building, you can't see it from this angle, the whole roof is sort of caved in. And one of the little items I've picked up recently is a bag of sort of scale rubble, and this scale rubble basically has bits of brick and tile and other bits and pieces in there, and I plan to add quite a few little piles of this rubble around the building to give the effect of where it's sort of caved in on itself. Well, obviously it's been hit by artillery or something in the past, and obviously these piles of rubble sort of remain around the edge of the building. As well as the building, I've also been working on the Mark IV tank, which you saw in the previous update. And as you can see, it's complete. I've nearly finished painting it. There's still a few touch-ups to do, and of course I've got to put the decals on and do the weathering, but I'm very pleased with how it's turned out as well. Now this tank, I must admit, was a massive pain to build. The first sort of real sort of fiddly bit on this was of course adding the drop rails to the top. So you can see the rails that run along the top from the back of the tank all the way along the top to the front. So that would have had what they called a ditching bar, and that would have basically been like almost a bit like a railway sleeper that was attached to the top. It would then be tied to the tracks via chain on each side when the tank got bogged down in mud, and then basically they would have spun the tracks, and it would have dragged that sort of huge chunk of wood underneath the tracks and into the mud, and hopefully it would have acted like an oar to sort of pull the tank out of the sort of the area it was stuck. And I plan to add the ditching bar on at a later date. But adding those to the top, they didn't have any holes to set them in, so you just had to sort of hold them there and glue them and hope for the best. And it took a good couple of minutes and a few choice words to get them into place, but I finally did, and they fit in there quite nicely. Another problem, of course, was the tracks. The tracks are made of rubber. They're quite stretchy and quite flexy. When you glued them on, they had a habit of sort of plying off and not gluing, and then getting glue everywhere. I pre-painted the tank before I put the tracks on, and of course quite a lot of the paint came off when I put the glue on and obviously put the tracks on, so I was a bit annoyed at that. But again, I've just got to touch up the areas where the glue got to, and then of course that will all be covered up with weathering. Of course the tracks will be absolutely caked in mud. The decals have got to be put on there, and I've got a few sort of mud washes and oil washes which will obviously bring out all the rivet detail as well. So from this angle we get an overview of the road, and basically I've created this by using sort of cardboard cutout from an old cereal box, and basically I've sort of laid out where I want the road to be, and this will form the foundation of the road itself. Now I've been having to think about the road texture, and I've decided to go with sort of a gravel effect road now rather than cobbles. And basically I've got a special pot of textured paint which I used on Compton Martin, which worked out really well. So I plan to sort of paint that on here. It'll be sort of more of a light sort of sandy colour this time round, and it'll have like static grass in the centre of the road to obviously give the effect that it was sort of a bit of a farm track really back in its day. And obviously it's still a farm track in its way, but obviously the tanks are now dragging mud up from the sort of the servicing area on there as well. So you can see where that tank's parked to there at the moment. Obviously there'll be muddy tracks sort of following it out of the yard, and obviously there'll be muddy tracks sort of pointing in every direction where obviously vehicles have been well sort of trodden in on the route in the past, sort of thing. So as well as that, you can see the area where the road crosses the railway line now, and obviously in previous updates I mentioned on how I'm going to do this, and I've decided to go with this method, which basically is where the main parts of the road are still in place, but in between the rails will sort of be filled in with sand. So there'll be gravel. The gravel road will sort of remain to the left and right of the rails, and then of course in the centre there as well. But in between the tracks themselves, I'll fill that up with a bit of ballast and sand and other things, to sort of give the effect where sort of soldiers have sort of chucked in a bit of rubble to sort of hold up the sort of centre, so obviously when vehicles cross they don't sort of knock the rails when they pass over. Now this of course brings us neatly onto the track work, so without further ado let's move on to the take a look at what I've done with the track plan. So all the track you can currently see in shot is actually pinned down and is basically awaiting ballasting. I'm still continuing with testing beforehand though, just to make sure everything works. The fiddle yard, I haven't got round to pinning the track down in there just yet. Basically I'm still toying with the idea of the track plan in there, so I get as much stock in there as possible, and I still haven't sort of figured out the best way of doing it, but there's so far I've got a passing loop in there and 2 sidings, and it's a pretty ample place for storing stock, but I would like a bit more in there, so I'm just toying around with a few more sort of ideas to see if I can make the most of that sort of area. As you can see in the distance there, I've gone with the 2 sidings idea, which I mentioned in update 2. I've had a few comments about this. In the end, I decided to go for the 2 sidings, purely because, again, looking at images of these sort of like, in a way, goods yards, they were actually quite substantial, in many ways, much more substantial than what I've depicted here. And sort of I wanted to really sort of capture that effect as well. And surprisingly, it doesn't take up as much as the scenic area as what I thought it would, even with the sort of the ridge in place. I thought the track would be right up against the ridge, but there's quite a substantial sort of area between it and the track. So there's plenty of room for scenery and other bits and pieces in there. As well as that, I've also finally got round to cutting a bit of flexi track, which fits in that problematic passing loop that was at the front. Again, if you cast your mind back to that same update, you remember the track fell short of the other end, and I said I was going to cut a bit of flexi track to fit in that gap and sort of bridge it, and as you can see, it fits in there quite nicely. And of course, I've had 2 trains pass in the passing loops for the first time. So I guess that's all for this update. One thing I'd like to say is thank you for all the comments you've given me, all the positive feedback you've given me in the previous updates, and all the information about the Great War and of course narrow gauge trench railways and 009 railways as well. It's been really, really inspirational. I've had some great links to sites on where to get items I've been really, really looking for, so i.e. modelled tanks and bits of scenery, and of course a 009 World War I rolling stock. I've had a few links to sites that I never even knew existed, and I've been typing in the names of these wagons and stuff, and nothing was coming up until one of you guys shared the link. So really, really, I would like to thank all you guys for that. It's been really, really inspirational, and it's been a great help. So I guess that's all for this update. Of course, more to come. Hopefully the next one will have a lot more scenery done, and hopefully we'll start blending in the hillsides, adding the mud and of course the ballast and other bits and pieces, and really started to bring this layout to life. So I guess that's all that's left for me to do, is to say this has been SDJR 7F88 speaking, and thanks for watching.